Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, the co-host. And Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. You know, the Congress in March 23rd, I believe, there was a piece of legislation introduced and nobody paid any attention to, and it was called Israel Anti-Boycott Act. And it was supported by and promoted by AIPAC because it has to do with Israel and the Palestinians, which is not an uncommon thing to happen in Washington. As a matter of fact, it was routine that this legislation, and for that reason, it was very easy to get the co-sponsors. And they got a lot of co-sponsors in a short period of time. They had 43 senators already signed up on the bill, and there are 243 House members. But all of a sudden, there was a report, one by Washington Post, I believe, and then also by Glenn Greenwald, and said, hey, hold on here. This doesn't look very good. Anti-boycott means that you can't express yourself. So we have two issues here. One is, the conflict between Israel and the Jews and the Palestinians. That is an issue that's been going on for a long time, and we're not going to settle that today. But the question is, and what is being questioned now by people who are very pro-Israel, are saying, maybe this has gone too far. Maybe this now is an issue of free speech because we can look at our recent history, the civil rights movement and, movement in South Africa on apartheid, that boycotts are very good. They're ongoing all the time. But this looks like they were signaling out one particular group, college campuses and the worst. You can't do this. You cannot, talk about a boycott of any business people that are doing business with Israel. So that is the issue. And now it's interesting to find out who's going to support this bill. How's this going to go? Most of the time, this type of legislation that has been promoted by AIPAC, it doesn't have much difficulty in getting passed. As a matter of fact, I think you noticed today that there were in spite of this negative publicity, there are 2 additional senators signed up for the bill.
Yeah, and I think what got people's attention is a couple of things. First of all, the draconian penalties. So if you happen to disagree with the policies of the government of Israel, and you decide I'm not going to purchase something made in Israel because I don't like their policies, nobody's going to know that because that's in your mind. But if you happen to go on Facebook and say, you know what, I didn't like Israel's policies, I'm not going to buy this product. If this bill passes, you could face a civil penalty of $250,000 and a criminal penalty maximum of $1 million plus 20 years in prison. It's a felony. So the penalty is so draconian for doing something that, as you say, is part of our history. Even the American Revolution was started in a boycott.
Well, this idea of promoting a boycott is what you're talking about on the internet or telephone or just organizing and having groups. But just recently, there was some mandates and dictates and pressures put on by our federal government civil rights movement that would dictate private businesses on what kind of bathrooms they would have.
Yeah.
And that was offensive to some people. So there's one issue. I don't think the government should be involved, but what if a businessman wanted to have these rules about bathrooms and not have men and women bathrooms? That's one issue. But what happened on the internet in different places, they got together and they said, why should we, who don't agree with what Target is doing, why should we buy their stuff?
Yeah.
And I understand there's been, there was a significant impact on Target, which means that, and the point you make is you not even allow, where you really get hit on this is where you stand up and you talk about it, encourage people to do things. So it is, definitely a free speech movement.
And the ACLU, which is very good in issues like this, has taken this up, and they've written to every senator and congressman and explained what this bill is all about. And this is something that they say in their statement. No matter what you think about the Israel-Palestine conflict, one thing is clear: the First Amendment protects the right to engage in political boycotts. And actually, I think we have a clip. Two of the guys from the ACLU had something in the Washington Post today about it, and when we get it up there, we can read it. It's just, I think this is actually, it's difficult to read now. If we can, especially we can come back to that later. But they point out that we boycott every day, for a number of reasons. Just part of being in the marketplace. Sometimes people disagree with Nestle's practices, for example, environmental practices. They can boycott. It's just a natural part of life.
Boycotts are making choices. That's what freedom is all about. But sometimes you get a bum rap if you don't make the right choices, then you're discriminating. But boycotting and making choices is discrimination, because you always make one choice, you have to reject the other. So it is, you're being discriminated, you're making choices, and some people, the authoritarians, don't like this idea, and they don't want you to have that much freedom. But whether it's left or right, and hopefully it'll be unified by libertarianism, the principle is the boycott is a right to speak out and a right peacefully to bring about change, especially if it's the government that's at fault. When Martin Luther King organized and led boycotts, he was boycotting against Jim Crow laws.
Yeah.
And he wasn't going to win the vote in the legislatures. So the boycotts there was a powerful instrument in the civil rights movement. And it was the same thing in South Africa. They used the boycott, which was instrumental. But no, I think it's a tremendous weapon. It's an economic weapon, and very frequently they come out on the winning side. But it's the way you can peacefully disagree. It's very close to civil disobedience. It doesn't immediately invoke disobedience of the law, but it's a challenge. But they're very much close together. Having boycotts, especially if there's a mandate, if the government is trying to protect that boycott and you still organize your boycott, then you are practicing, because there's a law, you're practicing civil disobedience. And of course, those who believe in peaceful civil disobedience, which I strongly believe in, is the way you bring about. To me, though, this is a demonstration. I think we've already seen some evolution here in the positive side, just in a short period of time. Nobody heard of the bill, and it's been since March. And then all of a sudden, there's a lot of articles now. And one, I think it was Joe Kennedy, who's a grandson, Joe Kennedy, said that he's restudying this. And there's a bunch of them restudying it now. There were some interviews of members who were co-sponsors, and many of them were, I didn't know it did that. I better go back. I'm a civil libertarian. I better go back and look at that. And the question is, how did they sign up? Well, let me tell you, I'm not shocked that they've signed up. I know how the system works.
Tell us about what is it like on the floor? Because I suspect what happened is someone goes around the floor when everyone's down the gathering or getting ready, and they push this around. What was it like down there when this kind of thing was happening?
Well, I had to listen like this and over here because they didn't come talk to me. but what happens is they name, there'll be a co-sponsor that's doing it. Well, and they'll put a little bit of pressure on you. Well, we're going to put this in today and all this. And they'll ask a few questions. But the key to this would be, this is AIPAC's bill. Mm-hmm. And that's magic. I've never seen AIPAC bring a significant piece of legislation that didn't automatically get an outcry for it. And it may have happened that some of it has been stopped, but generally speaking, just look at the tremendous numbers here. Even though some may drop off, it may be a tactical decision to back off, because I think this information is powerful, to criticize what's going on. But it's very tempting to go along with it and not read the whole thing. And that is what was evidence there. Some of these individuals went back and they asked them, and they were the co-sponsor. I said, I didn't know that was in the bill. I had one little story to tell, though. The Republican leader had a bill in. It was one of these resolutions of probably on foreign policy, and it sounded benign. And he came up to me afterwards. He says, Ron, why did you vote against my bill? And I quoted, it was short. I quoted the last line of what it did. He says, I didn't even know that was in there. he was the leader of the House. It was his bill, and he admitted he had no idea. He says, I didn't know about that.
And that's interesting. Glenn Greenwald's piece, which is terrific on it, he went back and asked some of the co-sponsors. Senator Bob Menendez said, gosh, when he was told about, this has got some First Amendment problems, gosh, I'd want to read it. Well, you think that he would before he signed on, but even the primary sponsor, Ben Cardin of Maryland, seemed to have no idea what was in the bill, according to Greenwald. He kept insisting that there are no penalties in this bill. There are no penalties for breaking it, which is, it's not explicit in the bill, but the way the bill is drafted, it refers to previous legislation, previous law, saying the person who violates is punishable under this section of a previous law, and there you have it. So it's, you know how they do that, it's curly-Q.
And they talk about previous law, and there was in 1977 a law somewhat similar to this to, prohibit anybody from boycotting Israel. And they were making this point, but it wasn't quite like this one. So when they're justifying, this is just like 1977 and we've had laws like this, but the whole thing is even if they hadn't made it worse than 1977, what if 1977 bill was a lousy bill and a violation? So they use that, for the justification. The other thing this demonstrates, when people shout loudly about why is Congress sitting still? Why don't you work together? Why isn't there bipartisanship? Well, by golly, there it is. There's the bipartisanship. And so often, when it comes to sanctions, we complained the other day, bipartisanship. And it looks like bipartisanship may well win out in keeping the government very much involved in the delivery of medical care, and that Obamacare won't be extinguished. I mean, it's going to be there because bipartisanship has ruled, and they have come together, and yet the people, especially the people who would like to take care of themselves, are left stranded. But this is pretty typical of the way it works. So it's too bad we don't have two political parties.
And I can imagine that this is being presented to other members on the floor, saying, "Look, we got to stop this discrimination against Israel and the Israeli people." But the fact of the matter is, and this is in one of the pieces, I think it was the ACLU piece, that this is not a discrimination against Israel per se, but it's against the policies of the current Israeli government. So it's not a discriminatory issue. And I think that's the reason why so many of the more progressive Jewish groups in America, Jewish Voices for Peace, even J Street, which is more moderate, not progressive, they've come out against this bill. They recognize how chilling the effect on free speech is. And they've come out, a lot of the groups have come out against it.
Yeah, and I think when individuals can take this bill, which we're trying to do, and talk about a boycott and turn it into a rights issue, because they at least understand it and they give lip service, and that's what the drawback was. I didn't know it was attack on freedom of speech. But of course, it's also a property rights issue. I see property rights as important in speech, but the subject of the right of free speech gets the attention of a lot of liberals. It should get the attention of all of us. But to me, it's more than that. It has to do with people's property rights. And when you get into the discussion of Israel versus Palestine, there's a lot of dealing with property rights. But this bill is dealing with principally whether or not a boycott can be a right, and what they're doing, and what Greenwald's upset about it. This is not a mild little change. This is something that he said that he hasn't seen anything like this in a long time. Our country is always tempted to use authoritarianism to tell people what to do, especially even during wartime, even during World War I and all. They do attack civil liberties, but this one's going a long way to attack civil liberties by essentially outlawing a boycott that we don't like, or the government doesn't like, and that, of course, is wrong.
And I think if I can just summarize what we said from my perspective, it doesn't matter your position on the Israel-Palestine issue. It doesn't matter if you're super pro-Israel. You should be opposed to this, because the speech that you restrict may come back to be your own at some point. So that's one. And if I can do one tiny little other thing, get your tickets to our conference September 9th in Washington, D.C., ronpaulinstitute.org/conference. All the details are there. We're going to have a great time.
Good. And by the time of September rolls around, we'll find out what's going to be happening to this piece of legislation, as well as the sanctions bill. Right now, it looks like the sanction bill might not be voted on today. There's been some resistance built up. We'd like to think that we contributed to that resistance, but quite frankly, it was probably the European Union that was starting to complain, about it. Excuse me. But anyway, I think this is an important issue. I think boycotts and nonviolent, is the way to go. We want to have resistance. We want to use nonviolence, and it is. The pen is more powerful than the sword. Of course, there's a lot of swords out there that we have to deal with. But ultimately, ideas have consequences. I think this is an example of what turned attention to something because somebody looked at something more carefully, made an announcement. So even those who have been supporting this bill and an attack on boycotts have suddenly said, well, maybe we should reassess this. It'll be interesting to see where this bill will go in the next week or 2 or 3. Maybe they'll take it out and change it a little bit. Instead of a $1 million fine, they might lower it to $500,000. And see, it's not quite so bad. But anyway, it's an important issue. I think the boycott is an important issue, and nonviolence resistance is very important. And I think that is the way we should bring about changes. And I think the best example of that is the movement that Martin Luther King led during the period of time for civil liberties. I think getting rid of bad laws is essentially what King was doing by getting rid of all the Jim Crow laws is the way to go. So you want to get rid of these laws that are bad because I think making choices and being discriminate and picking and choosing and having the right to pick and choose and boycott what you want, that's the way to find a more peaceful answer to our problems. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Come back soon.